The Texas sun had already burned away the morning dew by the time Caleb Harding reached the edge of Millhaven. It was not yet 7 in the morning, but the heat had no patience for such distinctions. It pressed down from above and rose up from the cracked earth below, turning the air into something you had to push through rather than breathe. The road from his ranch to town was 12 miles of red dirt and limestone dust, and Caleb had ridden it without stopping, without looking back, without allowing himself to think too carefully about what he was riding toward. His horse, a gray gelding named Flint, moved with the steady indifference of an animal that had learned not to ask questions. Caleb appreciated that about the horse. He had spent the better part of 7 years surrounding himself with things that did not ask questions. He was 35 years old, though the men in Millhaven who caught occasional glimpses of him would have guessed older. 7 years of ranch work had done what 7 years of ranch work does to a man. His hands were the color and texture of old saddle leather. His jaw carried the kind of set that came not from anger, but from long habit of keeping things locked behind it. He wore a black vest over a white shirt that had been white some hours ago, and on his right hip sat a Colt revolver that he carried the way most men carried pocket watches, as something you kept because you needed it and not because you intended to use it. The town of Millhaven, Texas, in the summer of 1884 was not a large place, but it was the kind of place that knew everyone's business and discussed it freely. Caleb Harding was discussed more than most, despite the fact that he was rarely seen. Perhaps because of it, a man who keeps to himself becomes a subject of speculation, and speculation in a small town has a way of growing into something larger than the original fact. People said he was cold. People said he was proud. People said he had come from money and lost it, or made it and hidden it, or simply turned his back on the world for reasons nobody could quite pin down. None of them were entirely wrong. None of them were entirely right. What they did not know, what Caleb had told precisely nobody, was that in the inside pocket of his vest, folded and refolded until the creases had gone soft, was a letter. It had been written by an unknown hand, postmarked 3 weeks before it reached him, forwarded through 2 different territorial post offices before it finally arrived at his ranch. He had read it 20 times. He had read it 20 times because reading it once was not enough to make it real, and reading it 20 times was not enough to make it bearable. The letter said in plain and unhurried handwriting, Eleanor May Sutton passed on the 14th of June. She left behind 2 daughters. They will board the orphan train on the 28th of July. There is an auction in Millhaven. I thought you should know. There was no signature. There was only that postscript sitting at the bottom of the page like a blade someone had left behind after finishing their work. Today was the 28th of July. Caleb did not ride directly into town. He turned Flint north first up the long slope that led to the hill above Millhaven where the cemetery sat inside its low stone wall. He had ordered a proper headstone 2 weeks ago, paid for it with money he did not think twice about spending, and it had arrived on Tuesday. He wanted to see it before anything else. He felt, without being able to explain it entirely, that he owed Eleanor May Sutton that much. He owed her the act of standing in front of that stone before he did anything else on this particular morning. He tied Flint to the gatepost and walked in alone. The cemetery was quiet in the way that cemeteries are quiet, which is a quietness that has weight to it. Mockingbirds called somewhere in the live oaks along the back wall. The heat pressed down. Caleb moved between the markers until he found the one he was looking for. The new one, the white marble that stood out from the older gray stones around it. Eleanor May Sutton, 1854 to 1883. Beloved mother, she made something beautiful out of whatever she was handed. He stood in front of it for a long moment without removing his hat. He was not a man who engaged in ceremony for its own sake, but this felt like something that deserved a pause, deserved the specific weight of a man standing still and acknowledging what was in front of him. He had known Eleanor May Sutton when they were both young enough to believe that what you wanted was simply a matter of reaching out and taking it. He had been 25 and the son of Thomas Harding, a man who believed that a family's name was its most valuable asset and should be protected accordingly. Eleanor May had been 19, the daughter of nobody in particular, a girl who had grown up making do and who had developed from that necessity a skill with needle and thread that was genuinely extraordinary. She could look at a piece of fabric and understand it the way some people understood music intuitively, without effort, as though the material spoke to her directly. Caleb had loved her with the straightforward intensity of a young man who has never had a reason to doubt his own feelings. He had loved her, and he had told her so, and she had believed him, which was perhaps the thing that sat heaviest on him now. She had believed him. His father had made the situation clear in the way Thomas Harding made everything clear, which was without ambiguity and without particular cruelty, simply as a statement of fact. You marry that girl, you lose everything, your inheritance, your position, your future in this family. I will not negotiate this. Caleb had been 25 years old. He had chosen everything. He was not interested in excusing himself for that choice. Excuses required a kind of energy he had stopped spending somewhere around his 30th year. What he knew standing in front of Eleanor May's headstone on a July morning 10 years later was that he had known she might be carrying his child when he left. He had known it was possible, had felt that possibility like a stone in his chest during the long weeks of his departure, and he had chosen not to wait to find out. Because finding out would have meant choosing, and he had already made his choice. He reached into his vest pocket and took out the letter. He read it one more time. Then he folded it and tucked it under the base of the headstone beneath a small stone he placed on top to keep it from blowing away. He stood there another minute. He was not a man who prayed with any regularity, but he allowed himself something close to it in this moment. Not words exactly, more a kind of acknowledgement directed outward at nothing in particular and everything at once. Then he put his hat on, turned around, and walked back to Flint. He had things to do. The orphan train had arrived in Millhaven the previous evening. By 8 in the morning, the yard in front of the First Methodist Church was already crowded with people. Townspeople who were curious, families who were looking, people who had come for neither reason in particular, but found themselves there anyway, drawn by the particular gravity that unusual events exert on small communities. The children had been arranged along a raised wooden platform at the back of the yard, 17 of them ranging from a toddler who could barely navigate the platform without assistance to a 13-year-old boy whose shoulders had already begun to carry the particular set of someone who has learned not to expect much. They stood in a loose line, each of them wearing the cleaned and pressed clothing that the placement agency required, each of them carrying in their posture the specific quality of people who are being evaluated and know it. Caleb tied Flint behind the general store and came through the crowd from the east side, moving along the perimeter, keeping to the edge of things. He was not a man who moved through crowds easily or comfortably. He had spent too many years in open spaces for gatherings of people to feel natural. But he moved with purpose, scanning the platform as he went with the same deliberate attention he brought to assessing a piece of land or a herd of cattle. Quick, methodical, looking for something specific without being entirely certain what it would look like when he found it. He found it immediately. At the far end of the platform, separated from the other children by a gap of perhaps 4 feet that might have been deliberate or might simply have evolved, stood 2 girls. The older one had hair the color of autumn oak leaves, a deep reddish brown, braided tightly, though several strands had escaped in the heat and curled softly around her face. She stood with her spine straight and her chin lifted at an angle that had nothing of defiance in it, and everything of a person who has decided that bearing is the one thing that cannot be taken from her. Her left hand was clamped around the shoulder of the smaller girl beside her. The smaller girl was remarkable in her stillness. She was perhaps 5 years old, with hair so pale it was nearly white in the hard morning sun. She held a stuffed rabbit pressed against her chest with both arms, a small brown rabbit missing its left ear, holding it with the kind of grip that spoke not of childish attachment, but of something more fundamental. Something that said, this is the last real thing, and I will not let it go. Caleb stopped walking. Even from 30 feet away, even through 10 years, and the changes that time makes to inherited features, he could see Eleanor May Sutton in both of them. The older girl had her mother's jaw, that particular combination of sharp and stubborn that Eleanor May had possessed to a degree that had always made Caleb simultaneously exasperated and admiring. The smaller girl had Eleanor May's bone structure, the delicacy of it, the way her frame seemed designed for precision rather than force. He stood there long enough that the man next to him turned and looked at him with mild curiosity. Caleb did not notice. He was doing arithmetic of a kind that had nothing to do with numbers. The man working the platform was a soft-voiced individual in a gray suit who managed to make everything he said sound like a sales transaction, which was Caleb supposed precisely what it was. He moved along the line with practiced efficiency. A 12-year-old boy to a farming family that needed field hands. A pair of 7-year-old twin girls to a couple who held them immediately and did not let go. A toddler barely walking to a woman who received him like something precious. Then the man in the gray suit reached the far end of the platform. Lot 14, he called out, consulting his papers. Ren Sutton, age 5. Healthy, quiet, no behavioral concerns. Would make an excellent addition to any family seeking a young daughter. A woman in a blue dress near the front of the crowd leaned toward her husband. He was a prosperous-looking man, well-dressed, the kind of man whose prosperity was evident in the particular ease with which he occupied space. They exchanged a few quiet words. The woman nodded. The man raised his hand. "We're interested," he said. "My wife has been hoping for a daughter just about this age." "Excellent," the man in the gray suit said, and his voice took on the particular warmth of someone who was about to close a deal. The word that came next was not loud, but it cut through the morning air with a precision that made the entire yard go still. "Wait." Caleb turned with everyone else to see the older girl push out of the line. She moved through the other children, pulling free of a woman in gray who tried to catch her arm, and she crossed the platform in 6 steps. She dropped to her knees in front of her sister and wrapped both arms around the smaller girl with a ferocity that was not dramatic but absolute. "Wait," she said again, and now her voice was shaking. But it was the kind of shaking that comes from holding something together rather than from falling apart. "You cannot do that. She is my sister. We go together. They told us we would go together." The man in the gray suit adjusted his expression to something that combined patience with mild irritation. "The older girl is Lot 15, Clara Sutton, age 9. Available separately if you would like to consider both." "We don't want the older one," the woman in the blue dress said. She said it without cruelty, but also without any particular awareness that cruelty might be an appropriate concern. "She's too old, and I've heard she's difficult." "I am not difficult." Clara's voice cracked on the last word, but she pressed through it. "I am her sister. I take care of her. She needs me." The woman in gray moved toward Clara with what was presumably meant to be a gentle hand. "We discussed this, Clara. Not every family can take 2 children. The Hendersons have offered a good home for your sister." "I am her family." The words came out of Clara like something that had been compressed for a very long time. "I am the one who held her when Mama died. I am the one who fed her when the orphanage forgot. I am the one who—" "That is quite enough." The patience had left the man in the gray suit's voice entirely. "Someone please manage this child before. You cannot have her without me." Clara threw herself over Ren completely. She was 9 years old and she was not large for her age, but she held on with a strength that surprised the 3 adults who moved to separate them. She wrapped her arms around her sister and locked her hands together at the small of Ren's back, and she held. And throughout all of it, throughout the pulling and the voices and the disruption, Ren made no sound. She pressed her face into her sister's neck and held her rabbit and said nothing at all. Caleb watched something fall. In the movement of it, in the struggling, in the reaching, something slipped from Clara's pocket. It was small and metallic, and it caught the morning light as it spun, and it made a soft sound when it hit the wooden platform, and it skittered toward the edge and the gap between the boards. Caleb moved without deciding to move. He was at the platform steps before he had fully registered the decision to be there. He came up 2 steps and bent and caught the object before it could fall through into the dirt below. He straightened. He looked at what was in his hand. It was a knife. Small, decorative, the kind a gentleman might carry for cutting letters or trimming a cigar. The handle was bone-yellowed with age, polished smooth by years of handling. And carved into that bone, carved deep enough that no amount of handling would have worn it away, were 2 letters. C.H. Caleb Harding. The knife he had given to Eleanor May Sutton 10 years ago. The night he sat across from her at the small table in her rented room and told her that he loved her. The night before he left and never came back. He had assumed she threw it away, or sold it in some difficult month when the money ran short. He had assumed when he allowed himself to think about it at all that she had disposed of it in some practical way, as Eleanor May tended to dispose of impractical things. But she had kept it. She had kept it for 10 years. And now it was in her daughter's pocket, carried the way you carry something that matters, but that you cannot fully explain the way you carry something that is both evidence and inheritance. Caleb stood on the edge of the platform with the knife in his hand and looked up at the 2 girls. Clara was still fighting, though the fight was beginning to go against her. The adults had managed to get her arms partway unwound from her sister. Ren was being drawn slowly backward, her face still pressed into Clara's neck, her fingers still holding the rabbit. He looked at the crowd around the platform. People were looking away now, crossing their arms. The man and woman in the well-made clothes were conferring in low voices, And even from a distance, Caleb could read the calculation on their faces. Too much drama. Not worth it. Some other child would be simpler. He looked down at the knife in his palm, at two letters pressed into bone. Then he stepped up onto the platform. The sound of his boots on wood made people turn. Caleb Harding was 6 feet 2 inches of ranch work in sun-weathered purpose, and he had the particular quality of a man who has spent years in large open spaces and has never entirely adjusted to the smaller scale of other people's expectations. When he walked into a space, the space changed. People paid attention, whether they intended to or not. "How much?" he said. The man in the gray suit blinked. "I beg your pardon." "For both of them, how much?" Silence moved through the yard like a wave. Even the mockingbirds in the live oaks seemed to pause. "Mr. Harding?" The man recovered himself. "I wasn't aware you were interested in—" "I am not interested in repeating myself." Caleb kept his eyes on the girls. "How much?" "The standard placement fee is $15 per child, but there are additional costs for travel and documentation and—" Caleb reached into his coat and took out his wallet. He counted bills with hands that did not rush and did not waver. He laid the money on the flat top of the podium at the edge of the platform. $100, he said. That covers placement, travel documentation, and whatever other fee you are about to think of. I want the papers drawn up today. Legal and binding. Both girls. My name. The man in the gray suit looked at the money, then at Caleb, then at the crowd. "Mr. Harding, with respect, you are a single man, a bachelor. The placement board typically prefers. The placement board can prefer whatever it likes." Caleb did not raise his voice. There was no need to. "I have 12,000 acres a house with more rooms than I know what to do with, and the means to provide for 2 children better than anyone else standing in this yard. If you would like to discuss the matter further, we can do it in front of Judge Amos Reed. I expect he will see things my way." The man in the gray suit looked at the money for another long moment. Then he looked at the crowd, which had gone very quiet, which was watching with the collective attention of people who understand they are witnessing something they will be talking about for a considerable time. "I will have the papers ready within the hour," he said. Caleb turned back to the girls. Clara had stopped fighting. She stood with her arms still around Wren, but the struggle had gone out of her, replaced by something more careful and more alert. She was looking up at Caleb with an expression that he recognized, not from memory exactly, but from principle, the expression of someone who has learned that hope is simply another name for the distance between wanting something and losing it. He crouched down on the platform. He brought himself to her level. Up close, the resemblance to Eleanor May was not subtle. Clara had her mother's eyes, that particular shade of green that was not quite the color of anything in nature, but belonged entirely to Eleanor May, and apparently now to her daughter. She had her mother's habit of looking at a person the way you look at a problem you are trying to solve. "I am not going to separate you," Caleb said. He kept his voice low, private, meant for her and not the yard full of people behind him. "That is the first thing. You and your sister go together. That is not a negotiation." Clara's jaw trembled. She pressed her lips together. "Why?" "Because I heard what you said, and you were right. Why do you want us?" Her voice dropped to something near a whisper. "Nobody wants both of us. They always want her because she's little, or they don't want either of us because I'm too much trouble. Nobody wants both." Caleb held out his hand, palm up, not demanding, offering. In his other hand, the hand she could not see, he still held the small knife with his initials cut into bone. "My name is Caleb Harding," he said. "I have a ranch about 7 miles north of here. It is a big place and a quiet one. There is room enough for 2 girls who need somewhere to land." Clara looked at his hand the way you look at something you are afraid will disappear if you reach for it. "What do you want from us?" "Right now. Right now, for you to come home with me. Get some food in you. Let your sister breathe somewhere that isn't a platform. And after that I expect we'll work it out as we go." Clara searched his face for a long time. Caleb let her. He had nothing to hide, or at least nothing that needed hiding in this particular moment. There would be time for harder conversations. There would be time for all the things that had no easy shape. But right now, what mattered was getting these 2 children somewhere safe. "Wren doesn't talk," Clara said finally. "She hasn't said a word since Mama died. That was a year ago last June. That is all right. She gets scared at night, has bad dreams. We'll handle it." Clara looked at his outstretched hand one more time. Then she placed her own hand in it. Her fingers were small and work-roughened, calloused in ways that a 9-year-old's hands should not be. She held on with a grip that communicated 2 things simultaneously, and she communicated them both with equal force. I am trusting you, and I will not forgive you if that turns out to be a mistake. Caleb stood drawing Clara up with him. Ren came too, pressed against her sister's side, still silent. But as Caleb turned to walk off the platform, the small girl's hand shot out and it caught a fistful of his coat. Not his hand, just his coat. Holding on to the fabric the way you hold on to something when you are not yet sure about the thing itself. He let her hold it. He did not pull away. The whispers started before they had even reached the edge of the yard. Lost his mind, 2 girls. What on earth is a bachelor going to do with 2 girls? Probably send them back before the month is out. Pour things out of one bad situation and into another. Caleb walked through the middle of it and did not break his stride. He had spent 7 years not caring what Millhaven thought of him. He was not about to start now. His wagon was parked behind the general store, already loaded with the supplies he had come to town for before the auction became the more pressing matter. Barbed wire, salt blocks, coffee, the ordinary requirements of a working ranch. He helped Ren up onto the bench seat first. The small girl settled herself with a careful economy of movement, placing her rabbit in her waist and her feet flat on the floorboards, and her eyes forward, taking in the new information of this particular perch with the methodical attention of a child who has learned to assess every situation before committing to it. Clara climbed up mostly on her own, accepting only the last small assist. Then Caleb checked the horses, climbed up beside them, and drove north out of Millhaven without looking back. They rode in silence for the first mile. The country north of Millhaven was the kind of landscape that made you understand why people stayed in Texas even when staying was difficult. The hills rolled green and gold under the summer sun, covered in live oak and cedar, and the particular tough grasses that knew how to endure heat. The road wound up and down, and from the higher points, you could see cattle in the distant pastures and hawks riding the thermals in slow, patient circles, and the white limestone outcroppings that marked this part of the state like teeth showing through the earth. Ren had fallen asleep before they cleared the edge of town. She was leaning against Clara's shoulder, the rabbit tucked under her chin, her breathing slow and steady. She slept the way a child sleeps when she has learned to take rest wherever it presents itself without knowing when the next opportunity will come. Clara sat between Caleb and the edge of the bench, creating a buffer between her sister and the stranger who had purchased their futures with $100 and no apparent explanation. "You scared?" Caleb asked. He kept his eyes on the road. Clara considered the question. "Should I be? Probably not. But I expect you'll be anyway until you have a reason not to. Most people would just tell me I don't need to be scared. Most people would be saying that for their own comfort rather than yours." Clara was quiet for a moment. "What's the house like?" "Big, quiet, more rooms than a man living alone has use for." He paused. "You'll have your own beds. Same room if that's what you and your sister need." "Same room," Clara said immediately. "I need to be able to reach her at night." "Same room then." Another mile passed. The heat was thickening toward its midday peak. A scissor-tail flycatcher landed on a fence post as they went by and regarded them with bright, skeptical eyes before launching itself back into the air. "Did you know our mother?" Clara asked. Caleb had known the question was coming. He had been waiting for it the way you wait for the sound of thunder after a lightning strike, knowing the interval, knowing it will arrive. "I knew her a long time ago." "How long ago?" 10 years, give or take." Clara absorbed this. "Did you love her?" The road blurred slightly in front of Caleb's eyes. He blinked it clear. "Yes." "Then why did you leave?" He pulled the wagon to a stop. The horses stamped. Ren stirred but did not wake. Caleb turned on the bench so that he was facing Clara directly. She deserved to see his face for this. She deserved not to be told a convenient version of the truth while he was looking at something else. "Because I was a coward," he said. "My family didn't approve of her. I chose the easy road instead of the right one. I was 25 years old and I was not brave enough to do what the situation required. That is the full accounting of it." Clara's eyes were very still. "Did you know she was going to have a baby?" The question arrived the way a stone arrives when someone drops it into deep water. You hear the impact and then the sound keeps traveling down. "I knew she might be," Caleb said carefully. "I left before I could know for certain." "So you left knowing she might be pregnant, knowing she'd be alone?" "Yes." Clara looked away. She looked at the road ahead, at the limestone hills and the live oaks, and the hawk that was still circling in the same thermal patient as the land itself. "That was a terrible thing to do," she said. "Yes, it was." "Are you sorry?" "Every day for 10 years. Sorry doesn't change anything." "No, it doesn't." They sat in the stopped wagon with the Texas sun pressing down on them and the truth sitting between them like something with weight and mass. Caleb did not rush the silence. He had earned it, and Clara was entitled to it. Finally, she spoke again, her voice gone smaller. Are we why you came back? Is that why you were at the auction? He chose his words with the care of a man who has learned late in life that precision matters. I came back because I heard your mother had died. I came to find her, to apologize, to try to make something right after 10 years. But I was too late. She was already gone. He paused. He let the weight of that settle before continuing. When I learned she'd left behind 2 daughters who were being sent away on an orphan train, I knew I had to find you. I owed her that. I owed you that. It was true. Every word of it was true. But it was not the whole truth. The whole truth included the knife in his pocket, the deep and uncomfortable certainty that these girls might be his daughters, and the fact that he had no way of knowing for certain without asking questions that would require a kind of honesty he was not yet ready to offer, and Clara was not yet equipped to receive. But that was a different conversation. A conversation for a different day, or perhaps for many different days spread out over time as trust was built slowly and carefully by people who had good reasons to be cautious about the offering of it. Okay, Clara said at last. She said it quietly with the tone of someone arriving at a decision they have been working toward for some time. I don't know if I can forgive you for leaving her, but I think Mama would want us to have a home. And you're offering one. So I suppose we'll try it, for her. Caleb nodded once. He clicked the horses forward. They continued north. The ranch came into view over the last rise of the road, and Clara drew in a slow breath at the sight of it. The main house was built from limestone and timber and sat solid against the green hills behind it, the kind of structure that had been designed to outlast the ambitions of whoever built it. There were barns and outbuildings spread to one side, corrals where horses moved in the morning shade, and beyond them, the pastures running out to the edge of the visible world, with cattle scattered through them like dark punctuation marks on a green page. That's all yours, Clara said. Ours, Caleb said. He said it before he had fully decided to say it, and then he let it stand because it felt correct in a way he could not have entirely defended. Ours. The wagon had barely stopped in front of the house when the front door opened. Ida Harding was 30 years old, and she had been built, it seemed, from the same material as the land she worked in, tough and honest, and not given to unnecessary decoration. She had warm brown skin eyes that cataloged everything they fell on, and the quality of stillness that comes to people who have learned early that showing what you feel is a luxury you cannot always afford. She was also Caleb's half-sister, though neither of them had asked for that relationship or spent much time celebrating it. She had appeared at his ranch 5 years ago, with his father's name and nothing else, and she had told him plainly that she intended to work as his housekeeper because she had exhausted her other options. She was skilled and she was thorough, and she did not require anything from him beyond a fair wage in a room that was hers. Caleb had agreed to those terms without negotiation, and they had existed since then in the same space but in separate orbits, maintaining a careful politeness that had never quite become warmth but had never collapsed into hostility either. She came out onto the porch and looked at the wagon, at the 2 small girls, at Caleb's face. Her expression moved through several things in the space of 2 seconds, before settling on something that contained both a prayer and a mild accusation. Caleb Harding, she said, what have you done? Ida, this is Clara, and the one sleeping is Wren. They're staying. Staying how? Staying the way that horse of yours is staying. Staying the way that stray cat is staying. Staying like family. Ida looked at him. Then she looked at Clara, who was standing beside the wagon wheel with her spine straight and her eyes moving over the house with an expression that combined wonder and the deliberate suppression of wonder, as though she had decided not to let herself want it too much until she was certain it was real. And Caleb saw the moment when Ida recognized something. It moved across her face quickly, but he caught it. The shape of the jaw, the particular quality of the green eyes, the way the girl held herself. Ida looked back at Caleb. Her expression had gone very still, very careful. We need to talk, she said quietly. Later. Caleb. Later, Ida. Right now, these girls need food. A long pause. Ida held his gaze for a moment that carried a great deal of compressed communication. Then she came down the porch steps and walked to where Clara stood, and she bent to the girl's level, and something changed in her face that Caleb had never seen there before. Child, Ida said gently, when is the last time you had a real meal? Clara thought about it with genuine effort. I don't remember. That's what I figured. Ida held out her hand. Come inside. I've got stew on the stove and cornbread in the oven. By the time you've eaten, we'll work out the rest. Clara looked at Ida's hand. looked at Caleb. He gave a small nod. Then she took Ida's hand and let herself be led toward the house, and the quality of that surrender, the careful conditional nature of it, the willingness to accept help, while keeping one part of herself in reserve, was so precisely Eleanor May that Caleb had to look away for a moment. He climbed down from the wagon, lifted Wren, who stirred but did not wake, and followed them inside. He carried her upstairs. Ida had already begun showing Clara the room. The two beds with their clean quilts, the lamp on the dresser that could burn all night at low flame if they needed it. Clara looked at the room with the careful attention of someone who is trying to determine the terms of a place before committing to it. Then she pulled back the quilt on the near bed and held out her arms for Wren. Caleb set the small girl down. Clara arranged herself around her sister with a practiced efficiency that spoke of 1,000 repetitions of nights in a crowded orphanage and nights in a boarding house room when Eleanor May worked late and the dark came early. "You'll be safe here," Caleb said from the doorway. "I promise you that." Clara looked at him from across the room. "People break promises." "Some people do." "You did. You promised Mama." He absorbed that. There was no useful response, and he did not insult her with one. "I did, yes. So why should this promise mean anything?" "It shouldn't," he said. "Not yet. You'll have to watch and see." Clara considered this. Then she pulled the quilt up over Wren's shoulder and settled her chin on top of her sister's head. She turned her face toward the wall and said nothing more. But she did not ask him to leave the door open, and she did not ask him to close it. She left that decision to him. He left it open a few inches, the lamp burning low, and went downstairs. Ida was waiting in the kitchen, 2 cups of coffee on the table. She pointed at the chair across from her, and he sat, and she pushed one of the cups toward him and studied his face with the intensity of a woman reading a map she has been denied access to for some time. "Those girls are Eleanor May Sutton's daughters," she said. "Yes, the same Eleanor May you told me about 5 years ago. The night you had more whiskey than you intended and said more than you meant to." "Yes, and you think they might be yours." "I don't know. I cannot know, not without asking the questions I'm not ready to ask." Ida wrapped both hands around her cup and regarded him with an expression that was not quite sympathy and not quite judgment, but contained elements of both. "Lord Caleb, you don't do anything halfway." "The past was never buried, Ida. It was always right here." He put his hand flat over his chest. "Every day. So you brought it inside, gave it beds, and a place at your table. I gave 2 orphaned children a home. You gave yourself a chance to feel like you're fixing something that can't be fixed." Her voice was not unkind, but it was direct. "Redemption doesn't work the way you're hoping it does. You can't buy your way out of 10 years of guilt with $100 in good intentions. Those girls don't know you might be their father. They don't know what you were to their mother. And instead of being honest with them, you brought them here and called it rescue. I saved them from being separated, from losing each other. Maybe. Or maybe you made sure you'd never have to face the truth head on." She leaned forward. "What happens when Clara grows up and figures out the rest of it? What happens when she understands you might be her father and chose not to claim her when it mattered?" "I'll tell her the truth." When she's ready to hear it. And who decides when that is?" Caleb had no answer for that. He drank his coffee and looked at the dark window above the sink and listened to the house around him, the creak of it settling, the distant sound of the wind moving through the live oaks outside. Ida stood, picked up her cup, moved toward the stairs. She paused at the bottom step. "Those girls deserve better than a man who is using them to make himself feel less guilty," she said. "They deserve someone who will love them for who they are, not for what they might represent to him." A pause. "And Caleb, if you let them down the way you let their mother down, I will make sure you know it. Blood between us or not." She went upstairs. Caleb sat alone in the kitchen with the cooling coffee and the particular weight of everything he had set into motion. He reached into his pocket and took out the knife one more time, held it in his open palm, looked at the 2 letters pressed into bone. He had given this to Eleanor May in a moment when he believed that wanting something was sufficient reason to have it. He had learned since then that wanting was the beginning of the story, not the justification for it. He had a chance now to write a different kind of story. He was not under any illusion that it would be simple or that he had earned the right to write it. But the chance was there, and he was done with the habit of walking away from things that required courage. He set the knife on the table. He looked at it for a moment. Then he picked it up and put it back in his pocket because it belonged to the girls, and they would want it in the morning, and he intended to be there to return it. He blew out the kitchen lamp and went upstairs to bed. In the room down the hall, Clara lay, With her eyes open in the low lamplight, one hand pressed flat beneath her pillow, over the place where the knife should have been and was not. She lay still and listened to the sound of boots moving through the house below, and then going still. She listened until the house had been quiet for a good while. Then, and only then, did she allow herself to close her eyes. The following morning, Caleb came downstairs before the girls were awake and set the knife on the breakfast table handle facing out the way you present something you mean to return. When Clara came down and saw it, she stopped in the kitchen doorway and looked at it for a long moment without speaking. "You picked it up at the auction," she said. "Yes." "You kept it all night." "Yes, and I'm giving it back." Clara crossed to the table and picked up the knife. She turned it over in both hands, studying the carved initials the way you study something you have looked at your whole life and are only now seeing fully. "C.H.," she said. "Caleb Harding." "Yes. Mama kept this for 10 years. She said it not as an accusation, but as a fact she was assembling alongside other facts. She could have thrown it away. She could have sold it, but she kept it where I could find it. Caleb said nothing. Some statements are complete without a response. "Did you come to that auction because you thought we might be yours?" Claire asked. He looked at her directly. "I came because I owed your mother an apology I can never deliver now. I came because when I heard she had daughters who needed a home, I understood that was the only apology left available to me." He paused. "And yes, because I have spent 10 years wondering whether I left behind more than guilt." Clara held the knife and considered him with those green eyes that missed very little. "Mama never told me my father's name," she said. "Just that he was gone and wasn't coming back. I used to ask her why people leave people they love, and she would say that sometimes being afraid is bigger than being in love, and that the only cure for it is time." She tucked the knife into her pocket. "Are you still afraid, Mr. Harding?" The question was not unkind. It was the question of someone who has thought carefully about fear and its remedies. "Some," Caleb said. "That's honest," Clara said. She sat down at the table and accepted the plate Ida was already setting in front of her. "Mama said honesty was the beginning of being trustworthy. Not the whole thing, just the beginning." She was right. She usually was. Clara ate a bite of biscuit. "You'll have to watch and see," she said, which was what he had said to her the night before returned to him now with a different weight. Not a wall, an opening. Small, cautious, conditional, but real. He sat across from her and drank his coffee, and when Wren appeared in the kitchen doorway a few minutes later, still half asleep and clutching her rabbit, she walked past Caleb's chair and stopped beside him. She looked at him for a moment with those pale, serious eyes. Then she reached out and tugged once briefly on his sleeve. She said nothing. She went to her own chair and sat down. Caleb set his coffee cup on the table and looked out the window at the hills going gold in the morning light. He had spent 7 years building a life specifically designed to need nothing. He was beginning to understand that what you build to need nothing is exactly what ends up needing everything. He was not sure yet whether that was a problem or a gift. Probably he thought it was both. The ranch in the first days of August settled into a careful rhythm, the way a river settles after something large has fallen into it. The surface smoothed over, the current continued, but underneath everything had rearranged itself around the new presence, and nothing moved quite the same way it had before. Caleb worked the ranch during the daylight hours with the methodical focus of a man who has learned that physical labor is one of the few reliable cures for the kind of thinking that goes in circles. He rode fence lines in the morning. He checked the water troughs in the afternoon. He moved cattle from one pasture to the next with the unhurried competence of someone who has been doing it long enough that the decisions come before the thoughts. His hands stayed busy. His mind went wherever it needed to go. Clara helped Ida in the kitchen in the mornings and spent the afternoons in the yard with Wren, moving through the space of the ranch with the careful attention of a child conducting a systematic survey. She looked at everything. She cataloged it. She asked precise questions when she asked questions at all, and she listened to the answers with a concentration that made you conscious of the fact that the information was being stored somewhere it would not be lost. Wren drew. She had found a stack of blank paper in the desk in Caleb's study, and she had asked for it with her eyes rather than her voice, standing in the doorway, holding a stub of charcoal pencil she had produced from somewhere inside the stuffed rabbit, and Caleb had given her the entire stack without hesitation. She took it to the kitchen table and spread herself over it, the way children spread themselves over things they have decided belong to them, and she drew. The drawings were not what you might expect from a 5-year-old. They were not imprecise. They were not the happy chaos of a young child playing at pictures. They were careful, deliberate, rendered with a patience and an eye for specificity that belonged to someone much older. Houses rendered with accurate proportions. Faces that actually looked like the people they were meant to represent. Hands, details of rooms, the quality of light coming through a particular window. Ida noticed before Caleb did, the way Ida tended to notice things before Caleb did. She stood at the kitchen table one afternoon and looked at the spread of drawings with an expression that moved from casual interest to something more focused, and then she said quietly to no one in particular, "These aren't random." Caleb came to look. He studied the drawings one at a time, working through them from left to right. A boarding house with a specific arrangement of windows. A woman at a sewing table under a lamp, her posture slightly bowed forward in the way of someone who has been doing close work for many hours. A landlady recognizable as a type, even if you did not know her name, standing in a doorway with her arms folded. A church with a wooden platform behind it, children arranged on the platform like a line of objects waiting to be moved. "Their memories," Caleb said. "Every one of them." Then he reached the last drawing in the stack and stopped. It showed a man, full figure rendered with more detail than any of the others. Tall, broad through the shoulders, dressed in the clothes of someone who has money and knows it. Hair going gray at the temples in a way that was precise enough to be a specific observation rather than a general one. And on his right hand, on the third finger, a ring. Large. A stone that Wren had shaded with such care that you could almost read the color from the charcoal alone. Caleb looked at the drawing for a long time. He felt something move through him that was not quite recognition and not quite dread, but contained elements of both. He turned to find Clara standing in the kitchen doorway watching him. "That's him," she said. Her voice was completely flat, all emotion pressed out of it by the effort of control. "That's the man from that night." The kitchen went still. Caleb set the drawing down carefully on the table the way you set down something fragile. He pulled out a chair and sat. Not because he needed to, but because something about the moment required the deliberateness of that gesture. He looked at Clara. "Tell me," he said. She came into the kitchen and sat across from him. She placed her hands flat on the table in front of her, fingers spread as though she needed to feel the solid surface beneath them. And she told him she had been supposed to be asleep. She had heard voices downstairs, a man's voice, and her mother's, and something about the sound of it had pulled her out of the warm half-consciousness of a child nearly asleep and brought her to the top of the staircase in her nightgown. She had sat there on the top step and watched through the gap between the banister rails. The man had been standing in the center of the front room. He was exactly as Wren had drawn him. Eleanor May had been standing near the window, and even from the staircase, even in the low lamplight, Clara had been able to see that her mother's posture was the posture of someone trying to hold their ground against something large. The man had said that certain people would not appreciate Eleanor May spreading rumors. Eleanor May had said she was not spreading rumors. She was telling the truth. And the man had said that the truth was a luxury that people with children could not always afford, and that certain arrangements could be made very comfortable arrangements if Eleanor May would simply be reasonable. Eleanor May had said she did not want arrangements. She wanted the right thing done. The man had said that the right thing was a matter of perspective, and that from where he stood, the right thing was for Eleanor May to take the dress she had been working on, the dress she had brought home, to finish and burn it. Tonight, before anyone else saw what was inside it. Eleanor May had said she would not. The man had poured tea from the pot on the table. He had done it as naturally as you pour tea when you are a guest, as though this were the most ordinary thing in the world. He had set the cup in front of Eleanor May on the table, and he had told her to think carefully because some mistakes could not be unmade. Eleanor May had drunk the tea. Within an hour, she was on the floor. Clara told all of this with her hands still flat on the table and her voice still stripped of inflection. And when she finished, she sat in the silence that followed without moving. Caleb looked at Ida. Ida was standing at the kitchen stove with her back to the room. She had not moved since Clara started talking. Her back was rigid in a way that communicated something contained at great effort. "What dress?" Caleb asked. He kept his voice even. "She said your mother was working on a dress." "Whose dress?" "Mrs. Ashworth's," Clara said. "Virginia Ashworth, the richest woman in Millhaven. Mama had been working on it for weeks, a ball gown, red silk, many layers. She brought it home to finish the hem, and that was when she found them." "Found what?" "Papers, hidden in the lining of the bodice. Mama didn't look for them. They were just there inside the old lining she was taking apart to replace it, and they fell out. She wouldn't tell me what they said, but she was frightened. She kept saying she didn't know what to do, that she couldn't just ignore it, that people needed to know. Caleb looked at Ida again. This time, Ida turned around. Her face had settled into an expression he had seen on it before, but not often the expression that appeared when she was making a calculation that involved a cost she had not planned to pay. Virginia Ashworth, Ida said. She did not say it like a question. She said it like someone confirming the name on a document they had been shown. You know her, Caleb said. I worked in that house for 3 years. Ida came to the table and sat down. She placed her own hands on the surface, and her posture had the quality of someone preparing to lift something heavy. Before I came here, when I had no other options, and that house was the option that presented itself. What are they like? Ida was quiet for a moment. She appeared to be selecting her words with great care, the way you select stones when you are building something that needs to hold weight. Judge Harold Ashworth is a man who believes the law exists primarily to protect the interests of people who can afford to use it, she said finally. Virginia Ashworth is a woman who believes her position in society is something close to a divine appointment. She has held it for 30 years, and she will do whatever is necessary to hold it for 30 more. Ida paused. And Douglas Crane. The name dropped into the conversation like a stone into still water. You know him, Caleb said. I know him. Ida's voice had gone very flat. He's Virginia's cousin. He handles her business affairs when the judge is occupied elsewhere. He is the kind of man who speaks freely in front of servants because he has decided that servants don't possess the intelligence to understand what they're hearing or the courage to repeat it. She looked at the drawing on the table. He is wrong on both counts. Caleb pulled the drawing closer. He looked at the precise rendering of the man's face, the gray at the temples, the ring on the right hand. Is that him, he said. Yes. The word was simple and certain and final. So what Eleanor May found in that dress, Caleb said, working it through, was evidence of something the Ashworth family wanted kept secret, and when she refused to destroy it, Douglas Crane came to her house and poisoned her. That is what it looks like. And the dress? Does it still exist? Ida looked at him with an expression that indicated she had already asked herself this question and had arrived at an answer she did not particularly welcome. A woman was talking to Mrs. Perkins at the general store, Clara said. She had been listening to the exchange between the adults with the focused attention of someone who has been keeping her own account running parallel to the official one. She said that Virginia Ashworth had worn a remarkable red dress to the governor's ball 3 months ago. Silk with gold embroidery. People were still discussing it. The kitchen went quiet again. Caleb sat with this for a long moment. He turned the information over, examined it from several angles, and arrived at a conclusion that was simultaneously obvious and almost impossible to believe. Virginia Ashworth had been carrying evidence of her own crime stitched into the lining of a dress she wore in public. She had worn it to an event attended by half the territorial government. That was not carelessness. That was the particular brand of certainty that comes to people who have never faced a genuine consequence. The certainty that no one will ever look closely enough because no one has ever dared to look at all. We need that dress, Caleb said. Yes, Ida said, which means we need to go into the Ashworth house and get it. Ida looked at him with the expression she reserved for statements that confirmed her long-standing assessment of the general quality of his judgment. That is what it means. You know the house. I know every room in it. You know the staff schedule. Martha handles the kitchen. Samuel handles the house. Virginia has a regular schedule. Thursday morning, she attends the charitable board meeting, which runs until at least noon. Ida folded her hands on the table. That gives us perhaps 20 minutes if we move correctly. I go with you, Clara said. No, Caleb said. You need me. Her voice carried the quiet certainty of someone who has already worked this through. I'm small enough to go through a window if the doors are locked. Wren drew the house. I can navigate it. And this is my mother. She looked at him directly. I have the right to be part of getting justice for her. Caleb looked at Ida. Ida lifted one shoulder in a gesture that communicated reluctant agreement. The girl has a point. She's also small enough to move through spaces where the rest of us are not. Fine, Caleb said, but you follow instructions exactly. No independent decisions, no heroics. Understood? And Wren stays here with Mrs. Freeman. Agreed. That night after the girls were in bed, Caleb rode into Millhaven to the small house near the creek where Mrs. Freeman kept herself. He told the old woman what he needed. She listened without interrupting, her hands still in her lap, her face giving nothing away, until he had finished. Then she said, "Those girls are counting on you now, all of them. And if you fail them, it won't just be you who pays the price." He rode back to the ranch in the dark, and when he arrived, Ida was still in the kitchen with the lamp burning low, and neither of them said much. There was not much left to say. The plan was what it was. The risks were clear. The alternative was doing nothing, and doing nothing had costs of its own. He had spent 10 years doing nothing, and he knew exactly what those costs looked like. The following morning, Caleb rode into town alone. His first stop was the courthouse. Judge Harold Ashworth held office hours on Thursday mornings, and Caleb arrived just as a land dispute was being concluded. Ashworth was a man in his early 60s, silver-haired and dressed with the careful precision of someone who has always understood that appearance is a form of argument. He had a face that photographed well, the kind of face that looked trustworthy and probably had for decades in exactly the forms where trust was most useful to have. He stood and offered his hand. "Mr. Harding, I'd heard you were in town recently. Quite a purchase, by all accounts. 2 girls needed a home. Very charitable. Though I'll be honest with you." Ashworth settled back into his chair with the ease of a man in his own territory. "It has raised some questions. A single man, no wife, taking in 2 young girls. People wonder about the suitability of the arrangement. People are welcome to wonder. If anyone has official concerns, they can bring them through the appropriate legal channels. I welcome any formal review." Of course, of course." Ashworth's expression remained perfectly pleasant. "It's just that my daughter-in-law, Miriam, sits on the charitable board that oversees child welfare in this territory. She takes her responsibilities seriously. She's expressed some concern." The message was not subtle, and Caleb did not pretend it was. "We are watching you. Step carefully." "I appreciate the concern," Caleb said. "If that's all, Judge, I have business in town." He left before Ashworth could extend the conversation in the direction it was clearly intended to go. His second stop was the street in front of what had been Eleanor May's workroom. The building was empty, now a sign in the window advertising the space for lease. He stood on the boardwalk for a moment, looking through the dusty glass at the bare shelves and the broken chair, and the absence of everything that had once made it a place where someone worked. "You looking to rent the space?" He turned. An older woman had come up beside him, arms full of packages from the general store. "Just passing," Caleb said. "There used to be a seamstress here. Eleanor May Sutton. God rest her. She was very good. Died a year ago, last June, typhoid, they said." The woman shifted her packages. "Virginia Ashworth used her exclusively. Always said Eleanor May had the best eye for detail in 3 counties. The dress she was finishing when she died, Mrs. Ashworth had someone come from Austin to complete it. Cost 3 times the price, but she had it done in time for the governor's ball." The woman lowered her voice. "And she did look stunning, I'll give her that. That red silk. People are still talking about it." Caleb thanked the woman and walked back to Flint. He stood beside the horse for a moment with his hand on the saddle, working through what he now knew. The dress existed. It was almost certainly still in Virginia Ashworth's wardrobe, because Virginia Ashworth was exactly the kind of woman who held on to expensive things, and exactly the kind of woman who believed that the evidence of her crimes was invisible, because she had decided it was. He turned off 2 miles short of the ranch road toward the small house where Doc Samuel Price kept his practice. Price was a lean, careful man who had been practicing medicine in this county for 20 years, and who had the particular quality of intelligence that presents itself as something quieter than it is. He let Caleb in without ceremony and listened without visible surprise. "I need to know something," Caleb said, "about Eleanor May, about whether she ever said anything to you about who fathered her children." Price set down the ledger he had been working on. "She was my patient for 2 years before she died. She was not a woman who spoke freely about her private life. I know, but I need whatever you can tell me. I need to understand what I owe those girls, not in a legal sense, in the true sense." Price studied him for a long moment. "I examined both girls when they came through on the orphan train. Clara has Eleanor May's bone structure, exactly the jaw and the cast of the eyes. As for the question of a father, the coloring of both girls is notable. The fair hair on the younger girl especially is not consistent with anything I knew of Eleanor May's family line." He paused. "Eleanor May did say something to me near the end when she was frightened, and I think she understood she might be running out of time. She said there were things about the past she had never resolved. that there was someone she had loved who had left and that she had carried that unanswered question longer than she should have. Did she say his name? No, but she said the girls would know him if they ever met him, that she had made sure of it. Price picked up his pen. I can write down my clinical observations, my professional opinion based on what I knew of Eleanor May and what I see in those children. It won't be proof in a scientific sense, but it will be honest. That's all I'm asking for. Price looked at him with the expression of a man who has spent 20 years listening to the questions behind the questions. A man who needs to ask this question has already decided the answer doesn't change what he intends to do. Otherwise, he wouldn't be asking. He'd just walk away. Caleb said nothing to that because there was nothing to say that would improve on the accuracy of it. He rode back to the ranch and waited, and the waiting had the texture of something that was neither patient nor impatient, but simply enduring. That evening, the third night since the visit to town, something happened that changed everything again. Caleb was sitting on the porch after supper when he heard the screen door behind him and turned to find Wren standing there in her nightgown, button tucked under her arm, and her other hand pressed flat against her sternum as though holding something in place. She looked at him for a moment. Then she held out her hand. In her palm was a piece of folded red silk, small and precise, a cutting from the interior of a dress. Caleb sat very still. Where did you get that? Wren's free hand moved a button. She turned the rabbit over and showed him the seam along the back recently restitched. She had been keeping something inside the rabbit. Something she had carried from the boarding house, through the orphanage, through the orphan train to this porch. She put the silk back into button and then produced from that same hidden space a folded piece of paper. Caleb unfolded it carefully. It was covered in columns of figures and dates entries for territorial funds received and dispersed over a period of years. At the top of each page in small, precise print, Territorial Charity Fund. At the bottom of each page, the administrator's signature, Virginia C. Ashworth. The numbers coming in and the numbers going out did not match. The difference was substantial and systematic, spread over 5 years, routed through accounts that had nothing to do with orphanages or hospitals or schools. He looked at Wren. She was watching him with those pale, serious eyes, her hand resting on Button's back. Wren, he said quietly, did your mama give this to you? Wren shook her head. She pointed up toward the direction of the boarding house, toward the place where she and Clara had watched from the stairs. She pointed, and then she pressed her fingers over her own mouth. She had taken it herself. That night, after the man left, and before Eleanor May stopped moving, she had understood that the papers mattered. She had hidden them in the only safe place she knew. She had been keeping them for more than a year, waiting for someone trustworthy enough to give them to. Thank you, Caleb said. He said it simply, the way you say something when the word is the only right thing and everything else would diminish it. Wren looked at him for a long moment. Then she opened her mouth. What came out was barely a sound, at first rough and unpracticed, like a door that has been sealed too long and resists the turning. But she pushed through it with the particular determination of someone who has decided that this specific moment is the one worth spending a year's worth of silence on. Scared, she said. Her voice was small and hoarse and exact. Man said children who talk too much have accidents. So I didn't talk. The porch went very still around them. He's not going to hurt you, Caleb said. Not you, not Clara. That is a promise I will keep. Wren looked at him for a long time, measuring something in the way she measured everything carefully and without rushing. Then she nodded once, pressed button against her chest, and went back inside. Caleb sat with the papers in his hand for a long time, looking at the dark Texas hills. He had his evidence. He had the testimony of a child who had chosen after a year of protective silence to speak. And he had the dress still to get, because the dress and its hidden documents together would be worth more than either alone. On the third day after the visit to town, he gathered everyone in the kitchen after supper and laid out what he had learned. They planned around the kitchen table with Wren's drawing spread across it as a kind of map, Wren adding details to her rendering of the Ashworth house as the planning required them, indicating which door opened, which way, which window faced the garden, which room held the wardrobe where formal gowns were kept. She drew it all from memory, from the glimpses she had accumulated during visits with Eleanor May. Caleb would handle the horses and keep watch. Ida would go in through the side window over the library and move to Virginia's room. Clara would follow and keep watch in the hallway. They would take the dress and leave. Thursday arrived with the particular clarity of a day that has been anticipated. The sky was deep blue and cloudless. They left the ranch at 8 in the morning. Mrs. Freeman had come before dawn to stay with Wren, and the old woman held the small girl close as they prepared to go. Wren stood in the doorway with Button pressed against her chest, her pale eyes tracking the departing figures until they crested the hill and went out of sight. Caleb looked back once. He turned back to the road. They approached Millhaven from the east, swinging wide to avoid the main road. The Ashworth house sat on a rise above the town, a large white-columned structure that had always struck Caleb as the architectural equivalent of a declaration. They tied the horses in a stand of cedar a quarter-mile from the house and went the rest of the way on foot through the garden border along the south wall using the rose beds for cover. The window Wren had identified was on the second floor above the library, accessible by way of a trellis covered in climbing roses that had been allowed to grow for decades and now formed something close to a ladder. Ida went first. She moved up the trellis with a quietness and surety that told Caleb she had thought carefully about every movement in advance. She paused at the window, tested the latch, and the window swung inward. She disappeared through it without sound. 30 seconds. Her hand appeared in the opening. Clara was up the trellis before Caleb had finished watching Ida's hand. She moved like a child who has spent years climbing things that were not designed for climbing efficiently and without hesitation, and she was through the window in less time than it had taken Ida. Caleb positioned himself where he could see the driveway and both ground floor entrances. One hand resting near the colt, not touching it, simply aware of it. Inside the house was as Ida remembered it. The thick carpets absorbed sound. The wallpaper was French, the portraits ancestral, the whole interior designed to communicate stability and permanence. They reached Virginia's bedroom without incident. The door was locked. Ida took a thin piece of metal from her pocket, a repurposed button hook, and worked it into the lock with the practiced ease of someone who had learned this particular skill in this particular house under circumstances that had made learning it necessary. 30 seconds, then the soft mechanical consent of a lock giving way. The room was furnished with the extravagance of a woman who has always had exactly as much as she wanted. A four-poster bed draped in imported silk, a vanity covered in crystal and silver, and along the far wall, two wardrobes. Ida opened the larger one first. "It's not here," she said low and controlled. "The red section, not here." "The second one," Clara whispered. Ida crossed to the second wardrobe, the one reserved for formal gowns. She moved the outer garments working toward the back, and there, wrapped in muslin, protected from dust and light, she found it. Crimson silk, gold embroidery along the collar and cuffs, the initials VA stitched into the hem with thread the color of old honey. Ida ran her hands along the bodice lining, pressing gently, searching, and her face changed when she found what she was looking for. "It's here," she said. "The documents, still inside." That was when they heard footsteps in the hallway, not the soft movements of a servant going about ordinary work. Purposeful footsteps, unhurried but direct, moving toward this end of the hallway. Then a voice recognizable and completely wrong. "Martha, I forgot my gloves. I'll be just a moment." Virginia Ashworth. She was not supposed to be here. The meeting was supposed to run until noon. It was barely 10 o'clock. Ida made the decision in the time it takes to blink. She pushed the dress into Clara's arms, bundled in its muslin wrapping. She pressed Clara toward the window, and then she stepped out into the hallway and pulled the bedroom door closed behind her. Virginia Ashworth stopped at the top of the hallway. She was a handsome woman in her late 50s, silver-haired, dressed with the meticulous care of someone for whom appearance is a form of work. Her eyes moved to Ida and widened with recognition. "I know you," Virginia said. "You used to work here." "Yes, ma'am." "What on earth are you doing in my house?" Ida met Virginia Ashworth's eyes with the specific quality of calm that comes not from the absence of emotion, but from its total mastery. "I came to talk to you about Eleanor May Sutton," she said, "the seamstress who made your dresses, the one who died a year ago, the one your cousin murdered because she found evidence of what you've been doing with a territorial charity fund." The hallway went very quiet. Virginia's hand moved to the bell pull beside the nearest door. "Samuel," she called, her voice unchanged, perfectly controlled. "Come here, please." The young manservant appeared, and his eyes went wide when he saw Ida. Virginia said, "This woman is trespassing. Restrain her while I send for the sheriff." Samuel looked at Ida. Something moved across his face, unresolvable between obligation and something older and more complicated. He did not move toward her. Ida understood immediately. She had once been in his position, and she knew what it cost. She did not blame him. "It's all right," she said quietly to him, not to Virginia. "I'm leaving." She walked down the hallway with her back straight. She descended the staircase without rushing. She crossed the foyer and went out the front door. Caleb had seen Clara coming down the trellis with the dress bundled against her chest, and he had moved immediately, pulling the girl into the cover of the rose garden. He had the horses, and he had the dress, and he had Clara. And now he watched the front door open and Ida emerge, and he watched the sheriff's wagon coming up the long drive from the road below. He moved toward Ida with the intention of placing himself between her and whatever was coming. Clara's hand found his arm. Her grip was not a child's grip. "No," she said. "They want you to make a scene. They want an excuse to arrest you too and take the dress." Ida knew this might happen. Her voice was shaking, but the words were steady. "She walked out there so we could get away with the evidence. Don't make that worthless." Caleb stood in the shade of the rose garden with Clara's hand on his arm and watched Ida be taken into custody. He did not move. It was the hardest thing he had done in a very long time. They rode back to the ranch without speaking. Clara placed the bundled dress carefully at the center of the kitchen table, as though setting down something that had its own weight beyond the physical. "Ida knew," she said. "She went out there knowing they might take her." "Yes, because it was the right thing. Yes." Clara looked at the dress on the table. "Mama would have done the same thing," she said quietly. The following morning, Attorney George Merritt arrived at the ranch, having driven through the night from the territorial capital where Caleb had sent a wire the previous afternoon. Merritt was a compact man with a reputation for thorough preparation and no patience for theatrical approaches to legal problems. He listened to the situation with his hands folded and his eyes on the middle distance, and then he said that Virginia Ashworth would not file formal trespass charges because doing so would require her to explain in open court what Ida had been trespassing to find. He was right. By noon, Ida was released. She came back to the ranch, still wearing the clothes from the day before moving, with the particular quality of someone who has been through something they will not discuss at length, but who is not broken by it. She embraced Clara and then stood quietly near the table where Wren was drawing. Wren looked up at her for a long moment. Then she returned to her drawing, which was a picture of a woman with straight posture walking out a front door while other people stood behind her. That same evening, when Caleb returned from a final errand in town, a courthouse deputy was already waiting at the ranch gate with a document in his hand. Virginia had not waited to see what Caleb would do next. She had moved first. The petition did not come from Miriam Ashworth's charitable board connections. It came directly bearing Virginia Ashworth's own name and signature alongside the territorial court's formal seal, an emergency hearing to review Caleb Harding's guardianship of Clara and Wren Sutton on grounds of moral unfitness, criminal association, and provision of an unsafe environment for vulnerable children. The hearing was set for 2 days hence, Judge Amos Reed presiding. Virginia had understood that the dress was gone and that whatever it contained was now in hostile hands. She had calculated that the fastest way to neutralize the threat was to remove the children from Caleb's custody before he could present anything in open court. She was not a woman who waited for circumstances to act on her. She was a woman who acted on circumstances. Caleb read the document twice. Then he set it on the table where Clara could see it. "What does this mean?" Clara said. "It means they're trying to take you and Wren away from me." Clara looked at the document with the focused attention she brought to problems that needed solving. "Can they?" "They can try. The hearing is in 2 days. We make our case, they make theirs, and Judge Reed decides." "What if he decides in their favor?" Caleb looked at this girl across the table. This girl who had already lost everything worth losing once, and who was being asked to hold on in the face of losing it again. He answered her honestly. "Then I appeal, and if that fails, I appeal again. But it won't come to that." "How do you know?" "Because we have the truth, and we have the evidence, and we have 2 girls who are willing to stand up and tell what they saw. That counts for something even in a system that has been bent as far as this one has." Clara studied his face. Whatever she was looking for, she appeared to find enough of it to continue. "Then we fight," she said. "We fight." That night, after the preparations were made, and Merritt had drilled everyone on what to expect in that courtroom, Caleb sat alone in his study. Doc Price's written observations had arrived by Ryder that afternoon. Price had been as good as his word. The letter was 3 careful paragraphs in the precise hand of a man who understands that what he puts on paper may outlast him. It said in the measured language of clinical observation that based on 2 years of treating Eleanor May Sutton and his examination of both girls, and on something Eleanor May had said to him near the end of her life about a man from her past and the way she had ensured her daughters would know him if they ever met him, His professional opinion was that Caleb Harding was not the biological father of Clara or Ren Sutton. It was not proof. Price had been honest about that from the beginning, but it was a doctor's considered judgment, and it carried the weight of 2 years of knowing the woman in question and the particular gravity of something said in a last conversation. Caleb read the letter once. He set it on the desk. He looked at the lamp flame for a long time. He had prepared himself for this. He had told himself he was prepared in the way that a man tells himself he is prepared for something he has never actually experienced. The distance between knowing a thing intellectually and confronting it in the specific light of a specific evening turned out to be considerable. He heard a sound. When he looked up, Ida was in the doorway. She looked at the open letter on the desk, and she crossed the room and took the papers from his hand and walked to the fireplace and put them in. She stood with him while they burned. "Make your case on love," she said quietly, watching the last of the paper curl and go to ash. "Not on biology. Love is the only case worth making. It's what Eleanor May would have wanted. Not a biological father who showed up 10 years too late. A chosen father who showed up when it mattered." Caleb looked at the fire. A sound at the door made both of them turn. Clara stood in the entrance to the study, holding the burned remnant of the letter she had pulled from the cold edge of the grate, enough of it intact to read the essential verdict. She had known, or she had suspected, and she had found a way to confirm it. "Mama never told me my father's name," Clara said. Her voice was quiet and entirely steady. "She said he was gone and he wasn't coming back. I've known for a long time that you weren't my father by blood. I didn't know how to tell you that I knew because I was afraid that if you found out the truth, you'd decide you didn't owe us anything." She looked at the burned paper in her hand. "I'm sorry I kept that from you." Caleb stood up. "Clara," he said, "listen to me carefully. I am not keeping you and Ren because of blood. I am keeping you because I stood up at that auction and made a choice, and I do not walk away from my choices. Not anymore. You are mine, both of you. Not because of what any document says, because of what I decide, and I have decided." Clara looked at him for a long time. Whatever she was measuring, she arrived at a conclusion. She set the burned paper on his desk. She went to the door. She stopped with her hand on the frame. "Good night, Mr. Harding," she said. And this time, in the quality of those 3 words, in the very specific way she said them, something had shifted. The measuring was finished. The verdict was in. It was not yet the full weight of trust, but it was the beginning of trust, and it was real, and both of them knew it. He stood in the empty study after she was gone and looked at the ash in the fireplace and thought about Eleanor May, who had kept a knife with his initials for 10 years and sent it forward into the future with the deliberate intention that her daughters would know him if they ever met him. It had not been chance. It had been a message. The only one she had left that could cross the distance she had not been able to close in life. Tomorrow there was a courtroom and a fight and everything that came with both. But tonight in this house, something had been established that courtrooms could complicate but could not undo. He turned out the lamp and went upstairs. In the room down the hall, Clara lay with the knife under her pillow and the particular quality of stillness that comes to a person who has set down something heavy. The secret she had been carrying, the fear of what it might cost her, had become something different in the span of 5 minutes. Not gone, but shared and therefore lighter. She closed her eyes. For the first time since her mother died, she slept without dreaming of the things she could not change. The day before the hearing, Caleb did not sleep. He lay in his bed and stared at the ceiling and listened to the house around him, cataloging its sounds, the way a man catalogs the sounds of country he is about to move through in the dark. The creak of the floorboards as the night cooled. The wind in the live oaks outside his window. The distant sound of cattle settling. And underneath all of it, quieter than everything else, the breathing of 2 children in the room down the hall, the rhythm of people who were depending on him in a way that nothing in his previous life had prepared him for. He had been depended on before. Ranches depended on the men who ran them. Horses depended on the men who kept them. But those were dependencies of function clean and manageable, the kind that asked only competence in return. This was different. This asked something. He did not have a ready word for something in the vicinity of presence, of showing up not just physically but fully with the whole weight of himself committed to the outcome. He got up before dawn and went to the kitchen and made coffee and stood at the window watching the sky lighten in the east while the house came slowly awake around him. Attorney George Merritt arrived at the ranch at 6 in the morning earlier than arranged, which told Caleb that Merritt had also not slept particularly well. They went over the evidence one final time. The dress still bundled in its muslin wrapping, sitting in the center of the kitchen table, like a piece of unexploded ordnance that had been made safe but not harmless. The papers extracted from the bodice lining the columns of figures and the dates and the name at the bottom. The documents that Wren had hidden inside Button for more than a year, corroborating every figure. The drawing Wren had made of Douglas Crane, precise enough to function as identification. Ida's testimony about 3 years of overheard conversations in the Ashworth household. And Doc Price's letter, his careful clinical observations laid down in the measured language of a man who understands that honesty properly documented is its own form of argument. Clara came downstairs in a new dress that Ida had arranged through Mrs. Perkins at the general store, simple and clean, and better than anything Clara had owned in some time. She sat at the table and accepted a plate of eggs from Ida without speaking, and ate with the concentrated focus of someone fueling themselves for a specific task. She asked Merritt 2 precise questions about courtroom procedure and listened to the answers and did not ask anything further. Wren appeared in the kitchen doorway a few minutes later in a yellow dress that had belonged to the daughter of a family 3 ranches over, yellow being the color that Ida had chosen for reasons she did not explain, and that Caleb suspected had to do with things that went deeper than clothing. Wren had Button tucked under her arm. She looked at everyone at the table, each person in sequence, and then she went to her chair and sat down and did not draw, which was unusual enough to notice. She simply sat with her hands in her lap and her eyes moving around the room with the alert stillness of an animal that knows something is different about the day. Merritt looked at Wren for a moment. Then he looked at Caleb. Something passed between them that was not a conversation but contained as much information as one. "She'll be asked to take the stand," Merritt said quietly. "I know. The other side will use her silence as an argument. They'll say a child who cannot testify cannot provide relevant evidence. I know that too." "Caleb, let her do what she's going to do," Caleb said. "Don't manage her. Don't prepare her for an outcome. Just let her be who she is." Merritt considered this. Then he nodded, once the nod of a man who has been practicing law long enough to recognize when the unconventional approach is also the correct one. They loaded into the wagon at 7:30. Mrs. Freeman came to the door to watch them go. Wren turned on the bench seat and watched the old woman standing in the morning light until the road curved and the house disappeared behind the hill. Millhaven had turned out. Caleb had not expected the crowd, though perhaps he should have. News of the hearing had moved through the town the way news moves through small towns, which is to say it moved through everything and left nothing untouched. The street outside the courthouse was lined with people who had come for reasons ranging from genuine concern to the straightforward pull of watching a conflict between the most powerful family in the territory and the reclusive rancher who had apparently decided, for reasons nobody could fully account for, to become their adversary. Caleb helped the girls down from the wagon and walked through the middle of the crowd without acknowledging it. He had Clara on his left and Wren on his right, and Ida walked behind them, and Merritt moved ahead to clear the path to the courthouse door. People watched and people talked, and Caleb kept his eyes forward and his pace steady. Inside the courthouse, the main room was already close to full. In the front row on the petitioner's side sat Miriam Ashworth, dressed with the careful expense of a woman who understands that clothing is a form of argument. Her expression had been arranged into something that communicated concerned civic responsibility, a woman performing her duty on behalf of those who could not protect themselves. 2 rows behind her, Virginia Ashworth. She had chosen a seat that said, "I am here because I care about the outcome," while maintaining plausible distance from the formal proceedings. She wore a dark gray dress and a composed expression, and she held a small book in her gloved hands that she was not reading. Caleb looked at her for exactly long enough to confirm that she had seen him looking. Then he turned away and took his seat beside Merritt at the respondent's table. Wren climbed into the chair beside him. She put Button in her lap and her feet flat on the floor, and she looked at the room with those pale green eyes that took in everything and gave back nothing that was not chosen. Judge Amos Reed entered at 9 o'clock exactly. He was large, white-haired, with the weathered look of someone who had spent decades making decisions in rooms not unlike this one, and had long since stopped being surprised by the range of what human beings were capable of. He called the court to order with a single strike of his gavel. The petitioner's case was presented by Marcus Garrett, who had been brought in from Austin specifically for this proceeding and who occupied a position at the petitioner's table that allowed him easy consultation with both Miriam Ashworth beside him and Virginia Ashworth 2 rows back, an arrangement that made clear who had organized and funded this effort and whose interests it was designed to protect. Garrett opened with the basic facts which were not in dispute and then proceeded to the interpretation of those facts. Caleb Harding was a bachelor with no experience in child-rearing, no legitimate legal connection to either child, and a documented history of social isolation that raised serious questions about his fitness to serve as a model for young girls. He had purchased these children at a public auction in what could most charitably be described as an impulsive act motivated by unclear personal reasons that had more to do with his own unresolved history than with any genuine consideration of the children's welfare. Garrett called 3 witnesses from town who testified to Caleb's isolation, his distance from civic life, his reputation as cold and unapproachable. Each of them was telling the truth as they understood it, which made their testimony harder to hear than if they had been lying. Then Garrett called Virginia Ashworth. She took the oath with the unhurried composure of someone who has been in formal settings her entire adult life. She settled into the witness chair as though she had sat in it before. Under Garrett's questioning, she described her relationship with Eleanor May Sutton as that of a satisfied employer with a valued employee. She said she had been away from Millhaven when Eleanor May died. She said she learned of the death only on her return 2 weeks after the fact. She expressed appropriate grief. She denied any dispute with Eleanor May in the period before her death. She denied any awareness of the papers that had allegedly been found in the dress. It was a polished performance. It was exactly as convincing as a woman of Virginia Ashworth's training and composure could make it, which was very convincing indeed. Merritt stood for cross-examination. He approached the witness with the unhurried patience of someone who has something to show and is in no particular hurry to show it, because the showing will be more effective if it arrives at the right moment. Mrs. Ashworth, you testified that you were in Austin when Eleanor May Sutton died. That is correct. Staying with your sister? Yes. And your sister would of course be willing to testify to your presence there. I have no doubt of it. How convenient, Merritt said pleasantly, that family can always be relied upon to support family. Garrett made a noise of objection. Reed acknowledged it and moved on. Mrs. Ashworth, Merritt said, do you recognize this? He lifted the bundled dress from the table beside him and held it up. Virginia Ashworth's hands tightened on the book in her lap. It was a small movement and she controlled it quickly, but the courtroom was quiet enough and attentive enough that several people saw it. It looks like one of my gowns, she said. More than looks like. This is the dress that Eleanor May Sutton was working on at the time of her death. The dress she brought home to finish the hem. The dress that was subsequently completed by a seamstress brought in from Austin at considerable expense and worn by you to the governor's ball 3 months ago. Merritt turned the dress and showed the hem to the room. Your initials, embroidered in gold thread, V.A. Is that your needlework, Mrs. Ashworth, or Eleanor May's? Eleanor May's, presumably. She made the dress. She did. And when she took apart the old lining of the bodice to replace it, she found something that had been placed inside it. Merritt reached into his coat and produced the folded papers. He opened them and held them toward the room. These papers document the systematic diversion of territorial charity funds over a period of 5 years. Money designated for orphanages, hospitals, and schools has been redirected to private accounts. At the bottom of each page, the name of the administrator responsible for those accounts, Virginia C. Ashworth. The courtroom was not quite silent, because courtrooms with full public galleries are never quite silent. But the noise that moved through the room was not the noise of disbelief. It was the noise of people hearing something confirmed that they had long suspected but had never expected to see produced in a public setting. Garrett was on his feet. Objection, Your Honor. This proceeding concerns the guardianship of 2 children, not accusations against my client that have no bearing on. They have direct bearing, Merritt said, his voice staying even and unhurried. The reason these children are before this court today is not their welfare. It is Mrs. Ashworth's. She is attempting to remove these children from Mr. Harding's custody because they are witnesses to her crimes. Clara Sutton was on the stairs the night Douglas Crane came to Eleanor May Sutton's house, and Wren Sutton saw things that night that Mrs. Ashworth has been counting on a 5-year-old child's inability to communicate. He paused. Additionally, the child kept something. She kept it hidden for more than a year. He held up the second set of documents, the ones that had lived inside Button. A second set of records confirming every figure in the first, preserved by a 5-year-old girl who understood without anyone telling her that what she had found mattered. The room absorbed this in a silence that had a different quality than before. It was the silence of people recalculating. Reed's expression had not changed, which with a man like Reed was itself informative. "Counselor," he said to Merritt, "those are serious charges. Do you have witnesses to support them?" "I do, Your Honor." "I call Clara Sutton to the stand." The room shifted. People leaned forward. Clara stood up. She walked to the witness stand the way she had walked through every hard thing in her 9 years of life, as though the floor beneath her feet was solid and always had been, and would be, and she had decided it. She climbed into the witness chair and sat with her feet not reaching the floor and her hands folded in her lap and her green eyes looking at the room without apology. She took the oath. She said her name. Then she said, "I am 9 years old and I watched my mother die." The public gallery went completely still. Clara Sutton told this court what she had told Caleb and Ida in the kitchen of his ranch. She told it with the same stripped-down precision, the same deliberate removal of everything except the facts, as though she had decided that the facts were powerful enough on their own and did not need decoration. She described the man, she described the argument, she described the tea being poured and her mother drinking it and what happened afterward. She pointed at Douglas Crane, who was sitting in the gallery, and she said his name and she said what he had done, and Douglas Crane sat very still in a way that was itself a kind of answer. Garrett cross-examined her for 20 minutes with the patient persistence of someone trying to find a crack in something that had no cracks. He asked about the light in the room and the distance from the stairs and the possibility of a child's misremembering. Clara answered each question the way she answered all questions, directly, without elaboration, without backing away from anything she had said. When Garrett had finished, he sat down with the expression of a man who has used all his tools and found that the material he was working with was simply harder than the tools. Ida took the stand next. She walked to the witness chair with her head level and her eyes on the room. She sat down and put her hands in her lap and told the court what she had seen and heard during 3 years in the Ashworth household. She described conversations between Virginia and Douglas Crane about the movement of money. She described documents she had seen on the judge's desk, documents she had not been meant to see because she had not been meant to be a person capable of understanding them. She described the systematic, unhurried pattern of a family that had been taking what it wanted for so long that the taking had become invisible to them. Garrett's cross-examination was direct. "You're asking this court to believe the testimony of a woman who worked as a domestic servant more than a decade ago against the testimony of one of the most respected families in this territory. On what basis should your word be taken over theirs?" "On the basis that I am telling the truth," Ida said, "and on the basis that the papers from that dress say the same thing I'm saying, and papers don't have reasons to lie." She paused. "I was silent for 12 years because I was afraid. Because speaking up meant putting myself in danger that I had no protection against. Because I had no proof and no power and no reason to believe anyone would choose my account over theirs." She looked at the room and not at any particular person in it. "But I have proof now, and I have reason now, and I will not be silent anymore." The room received this in silence. Reed looked at Merritt. "Do you have additional witnesses?" "One more, Your Honor," Merritt said. "I call Wren Sutton to the stand." What happened in the room then was a particular kind of silence that is different from ordinary silence. It was the silence of a large number of people arriving simultaneously at the same understanding, which was that they were watching something they had not anticipated and did not know how to categorize. Everyone in Millhaven knew that Wren Sutton did not speak. Miriam Ashworth leaned forward with the expression of a person who has just seen the ground shift in their favor. Virginia Ashworth's hands tightened on the book in her lap. In the gallery, Douglas Crane sat very still. Wren stood up. She was 5 years old and she was small, and she walked to the front of the courtroom with Button under her arm and her yellow dress and her pale hair and her green eyes, and she climbed into the witness chair, and she was nearly swallowed by it, her feet not reaching the floor by a considerable distance, her small frame making the large wooden chair look like something built for a different scale of creature entirely. She looked at the room. She looked at it the way she looked at everything, with the concentrated cataloging attention of someone who has learned that seeing things clearly is one of the most important skills available to a person who cannot control very much else. Then she looked at Caleb. He was sitting at the respondent's table 30 feet away, and he looked back at her with the particular quality of attention that he hoped communicated, "I am here. Whatever happens, I am here." Reed leaned forward in his chair. His voice when he spoke to her was something other than his courtroom voice. It was the voice of a man who has grandchildren and knows how to speak to someone small without making them feel smaller. "Miss Wren," he said, "do you know where you are?" Wren nodded. Do you understand that some people would like to take you and your sister away from Mr. Harding? Wren nodded again, and this time the nod was not ambiguous. It was the nod of a person who understands something clearly and has strong feelings about it. And do you want to stay with Mr. Harding? The nod that answered this question involved her entire upper body. Reed looked at her for a moment. I appreciate that, child, but I need more than a nod. I need to understand what you want and what you need. Is there any way you can show me? Wren sat still. The courtroom sat still with her. Miriam Ashworth's expression had settled into something that looked like patience, but was actually the more specific quality of a person waiting for a foregone conclusion to arrive. Virginia Ashworth's gloved hands held the book. Douglas Crane sat in the gallery and did not move. Then Wren reached under Button and produced a folded piece of paper. She unfolded it with the careful deliberateness of someone handling something that matters. She held it up toward Judge Reed. It was a drawing. 3 figures standing in front of a house. A tall man in a hat, a girl with dark braided hair holding his hand, a small girl between them holding both their hands. Above the house, written in the unsteady but legible letters of a child who has been practicing a single word. Home. The room went very quiet. Then Wren's mouth opened. Virginia Ashworth poisoned my mama. Her voice was small. It was rough from disuse, the voice of someone who has not exercised it in a very long time and finds it slightly unfamiliar, like a tool that has been put away too long. But it carried in the silence of the courtroom with a clarity that owed nothing to volume. Every head in the room turned toward her. Not just Mr. Crane, her too. She came after he left. I was on the stairs, I saw. Virginia Ashworth stood up. This is absurd, she said, and her voice was controlled, but something had gone wrong with the control. There was a thinness to it that had not been there before, the quality of something under pressure that is approaching its limit. A child's fantasy. I was in Austin. I have already testified. She came back early, Wren said. She was still looking at Judge Reed, not at Virginia, speaking in the specific direction of the person she had decided to address. Because Mr. Crane told her mama wouldn't agree. So she came back herself. I was on the stairs. She stood in the doorway and she told mama she should have burned the papers when she had the chance. That she should have been reasonable. I will not sit here and be accused by a child who has not spoken a word in a year and is clearly being. Then she poured more poison in mama's tea, Wren said. The tea that was already there on the table from when Mr. Crane was there before. She made mama drink it. And mama looked at me and Clara and she tried to say something, but she couldn't get the words out. And then she stopped moving. The silence that followed was not the silence of a room waiting for something. It was the silence of a room that has just received something and has not yet found its way to the other side of it. Virginia Ashworth was still standing. The color had gone from her face in the specific way that color goes from a face when a person understands that the thing they have been preventing has happened, that the conversation they have been avoiding for a year is taking place in the worst possible venue and in front of the worst possible audience. I remember your ring, Wren said, the green stone. Mama used to take me when she delivered dresses. I saw the ring at your house. I know it's you. Virginia's right hand moved to her left, an instinctive, uncontrolled gesture of concealment that arrived too late by approximately 12 months. The emerald ring was there, large, distinctive, exactly as Wren had described it, and exactly as Wren had drawn it in the charcoal picture that had started all of this. The room saw the gesture. The room understood the gesture. Reed brought his gavel down. Order. Douglas Crane stood abruptly in the gallery, his chair scraping backward on the wooden floor. 2 deputies moved toward him from the sides of the room before he had taken a single step. Garrett, who had organized this entire proceeding on behalf of the Ashworth family interests, reached for Virginia's arm, speaking to her in a rapid undertone that was audible in its urgency, if not its content. Miriam Ashworth sat in the front row and did not move. She sat with her hands in her lap and her eyes moving between the ring on Virginia's finger and the small girl in the witness chair, and the figure of Douglas Crane being guided firmly back to his seat by a deputy who was not asking for his cooperation. She sat through all of it with the expression of a woman who is doing arithmetic, whose answer she does not want to reach, but cannot stop herself from reaching. Reed's gavel came down again and again. Order returned slowly, the way order always returns to a room that has had something large dropped into it unevenly and with some reluctance. When the noise had settled enough, Reed spoke. Mrs. Ashworth, he said, I am ordering a criminal investigation into the death of Eleanor May Sutton. Based on the testimony heard in this proceeding and the documentary evidence presented, I have sufficient grounds to believe that death was not natural. Pending the outcome of a formal investigation, you will be placed under house arrest." He looked at the deputies. "See to it." Virginia began to speak. Reed lifted one hand and she stopped. "Mr. Crane," Reed said, turning his attention to the gallery, "you will remain in this building. Deputies." Douglas Crane looked at the deputy beside him and appeared to calculate something. Whatever conclusion he reached produced no movement toward the door. He sat. Virginia was escorted from the room. She did not go quietly, but she went. Miriam Ashworth watched her mother-in-law leave. She sat with this for a moment that was longer than the moments around it, a moment in which something visible was happening behind her carefully maintained expression, a process of arriving somewhere she had been traveling toward without knowing it. Then she stood. "Your Honor," she said, "I would like to withdraw my petition." Garrett turned to her with the urgency of a man who has just seen the ground disappear beneath his feet. "Mrs. Ashworth, we discussed the strategy, and I would strongly advise. The strategy was built on protecting my family," Miriam said. She removed her hand from Garrett's reach without looking at him. "I will not take children away from someone who loves them in order to protect a woman who killed their mother." She looked at Caleb directly. He met her eyes. "Mr. Harding," she said, "I was wrong about you, and I was wrong to let my family's influence convince me that what I was doing was right." Then she walked out of the courtroom, and the room watched her go with the particular attention that rooms give to exits that change the shape of everything. Reed waited for quiet. When he had it, he turned to Caleb. "Mr. Harding," he said, "I have a question, and I want you to answer it honestly." "Yes, Your Honor." "Doc Price submitted a letter to this court this morning at my request. His clinical observations regarding the children's origins. His professional opinion is that there is no biological connection between you and these children. You are not their father by blood. Is that your understanding as well?" The room went very still. "That is my understanding, Your Honor. And yet you are here today fighting for the right to keep them." "Yes. Why?" Caleb stood up. He was not a man who prepared speeches. He was not built for the kind of eloquence that moves crowds, and he knew it, and he had learned over the years that this was not a deficiency he needed to compensate for because plain speech had a quality of its own that rhetoric sometimes obscured. He looked at Clara, who was watching him from her seat with those green eyes that had been measuring and assessing and deciding things since the moment he first saw her on a July morning that had rearranged the rest of his life. He looked at Wren still in the witness chair, still holding Button, watching him with the pale, steady gaze of someone who has already made her decision and is waiting to see if he will make his. He looked at Ida standing along the sidewall, her back straight, her expression giving nothing away except the very specific thing it had always given away to people who knew how to read it, which was that she was entirely committed to whatever came next. "Because they are mine," Caleb said, "not by blood, by choice. And choice is a harder thing than blood. Blood doesn't ask you to decide. Blood is just something that happens to you. Choice asks you to look at a situation clearly and say, this is where I stand and I will not move from it." He paused. "I left their mother 10 years ago because I was not the man I needed to be. I cannot change that. I cannot apologize to her because she is not here to receive the apology. The only thing I can do is be the man I needed to be 10 years ago now for these two girls. And I intend to do that. Not because of what I owe, not because of guilt, because those girls are my daughters in every way that matters, and I will stand in front of every court that asks me to make that case, and I will make it every time." He sat down. The room was quiet in the way that rooms go quiet when they have heard something that has settled something. Reed looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at Clara, then at Wren, then back at the surface of his desk. "Mr. Harding," he said, "I am going to ask you one final question. I want you to think before you answer it." "Yes, Your Honor." "Do you promise to raise these children with honesty, integrity, and love, to give them education and opportunity, to protect them from harm, to be their father in every way that counts, when it is difficult, when it is costly, when the easy road would be to step back and let someone else carry the weight?" Caleb looked at Clara and Wren. They looked back at him. "I promise," he said, "with everything I have and everything I am." Reed picked up his gavel. He held it for a moment. Then he brought it down. "The petition is denied. Full legal guardianship is granted to Caleb Harding." He let the room absorb this before continuing. "Furthermore, I am ordering expedited adoption proceedings to make this arrangement permanent and irrevocable. These children will hereafter be known as Clara and Wren Harding daughters, not by blood, but by choice, which is the strongest kind of family this court has ever had the privilege of recognizing." He looked at the girls. "You are going home." Clara made no sound. She simply closed her eyes for a moment, the way a person closes their eyes when something they have been holding together for a very long time is finally allowed to come apart safely. When she opened them again, there were tears on her face that she did not bother to wipe away. Wren climbed down from the witness chair. She walked across the front of the courtroom with Button under her arm, and her yellow dress, and her pale hair, and her green eyes, and she walked directly to Caleb, who had risen from his chair, and she held up her arms. He picked her up. She pressed her face into his shoulder, and she cried. Not the silent, contained weeping of a child who has learned to keep her grief inward. Real crying, the kind that comes from deep down, the kind that shakes a small body and catches in the throat and refuses to be managed. The crying of a child who has been holding something very heavy for a very long time and has finally been given permission to set it down. Caleb held her. He held her in the front of the Millhaven courthouse with half the town watching, and he did not care about any of it, and the room around them did something that courtrooms almost never do. It applauded. Outside the courthouse in the November air that had turned cold and clean since morning, Douglas Crane was already speaking to the territorial prosecutor before the courthouse doors had fully closed behind the last of the crowd. He had made his calculation. He had decided that loyalty to Virginia Ashworth was worth considerably less than the alternative available to him, which was cooperation in exchange for consideration. The prosecutor listened with the patience of a man who has been doing this long enough to recognize when someone is about to hand him everything he needs. It would take months for the full weight of justice to arrive. Investigations take time. Trials take time. The machinery of the law is slow and sometimes halting, but once pointed in the right direction, it moves with a thoroughness that money and position can delay, but cannot ultimately stop. Standing on the courthouse steps with Wren still pressed against his shoulder, and Clara's hand finding his, and Ida at his left side with her face turned toward the cold November sky, Caleb Harding understood that it was coming. The thread had been pulled. The whole cloth would unravel, and there was nothing left in the world that could stop it. Some things, once started, run all the way to the end. In the weeks that followed, the machinery of justice moved with the particular combination of slowness and irreversibility that characterizes institutions when they have finally been pointed in the right direction. The investigation into Eleanor May Sutton's death was thorough. The territorial medical examiner in Austin confirmed what Clara had known since the night it happened, what the speed and the symptoms had been telling anyone willing to read them. Eleanor May had been poisoned. Arsenic administered in sufficient quantity to kill an otherwise healthy woman within hours. Douglas Crane was formally arrested in the third week of August. He told the territorial prosecutor everything specific and detailed and accurate because the evidence that existed would have made any significant deviation from the truth immediately obvious. He confirmed what Wren had said from the witness chair. Virginia Ashworth had come to Eleanor May's boarding house that night. She had come because Douglas Crane had reported his failure, and Virginia Ashworth was not a woman who accepted failure in matters she had decided were important. She had finished what Crane had started. She had stood in Eleanor May Sutton's front room, in her good clothes with her emerald ring on her finger, and she had made certain of it. Virginia Ashworth was charged with murder in the first degree. Her attorneys from Dallas mounted a defense that was expensive and thorough, built on her social position and the argument that the testimony of a 5-year-old child who had not spoken for a year was inherently unreliable. The defense collapsed in the second week of November when the jury deliberated for 4 hours and returned a verdict that Millhaven received in a silence that lasted approximately 30 seconds before becoming something else entirely. She was sentenced in December, not house arrest, not a fine, not the kind of outcome that money and position and 30 years of accumulated influence could manage and mitigate and eventually make disappear. Prison. Judge Harold Ashworth resigned from the bench 2 days after his wife's conviction, citing health reasons that nobody believed and nobody argued with, because the alternative was a formal investigation that would have been unpleasant for everyone involved, and particularly for the judge. The resignation was accepted. The career was over. The Territorial Charity Fund received a full accounting of everything that had been diverted over 5 years. The sum was substantial. Restitution was ordered and paid partly from the Ashworth family assets and partly from a quiet contribution made by Miriam Ashworth from her own separate property, a contribution that was not legally required and that nobody asked her to explain. The orphanages received money they had been owed for years. The hospital in the eastern part of the territory received money it had been owed for years. 3 schools for freed families in the southern counties received money they had been owed for years. The children who had grown up in those institutions during the years of the theft would never know exactly what had been taken from them, but they would benefit going forward from what had been returned. Ida testified at both trials. She sat in the witness chair each time with the same quality of stillness and the same flat, precise voice. And she said what she knew, and she did not embellish it, and she did not retreat from it. And each time she descended from the witness stand, she carried herself with the specific quality of a person who has set down something they have been carrying for a very long time and has discovered that the weight was even greater than they had realized while they were carrying it. She did not receive an apology from the Ashworth family. She did not expect one. But her testimony stood in the permanent record of 2 separate legal proceedings, the account of what she had seen and heard during 3 years in a house where she had been considered too inconsequential to require discretion. It stood there in the record, and it was true, and it was hers, and nobody could take it back. That she told Caleb one evening in the kitchen when they were the only 2 awake was sufficient. On a morning in February of 1885, the sky was the particular shade of blue that Texas produces in winter, cold and clean and honest, and the 4 of them drove to Millhaven in the wagon and walked up the hill to the cemetery where the white marble headstone stood. Eleanor May Sutton, 1854 to 1883, beloved mother. She made something beautiful out of whatever she was handed. The ground around the stone was winter dry, and the live oaks along the back wall were bare of leaves, but present still the permanent architecture of things that understand how to wait. Caleb stood in front of the stone for a moment before he spoke, and in that moment he was not performing anything for anyone. He was simply standing in front of a fact he had spent 10 years avoiding and was finally willing to look at directly. He placed his hand flat against the cold marble. "Eleanor May," he said, "I came here in July to apologize to you and you were already gone. I was 10 years too late for that conversation. I don't have a way to change that. What I can tell you is this." He paused. "Your daughters are safe. They are loved. They have a home and a future in every opportunity I can give them. The people responsible for what happened to you have answered for it in the way that things are answered for when the evidence is sufficient and the witnesses are brave enough to speak. Your name is on a proper stone and it will not be forgotten." He took a breath. "I am not their father by blood, but I am their father, and I will be their father until I am not capable of it anymore. That is a promise to you, and I keep my promises. I understand that you have no particular reason to believe that given the history, but I keep them now. That is a different man than the one you knew, and he is the one standing here." He stepped back. Clara knelt beside where his hand had been and pressed her own against the stone. "Mama," she said, "we found a home. I found a family. It's not the one you might have wanted for me, but it's the one I needed. Papa Caleb is not perfect, but he stays, and staying is what matters." She was quiet for a moment. "I'm learning to sew. I thought you'd want to know that." Wren did not speak. She crouched beside Clara and placed her drawing carefully against the base of the stone, protected by a piece of glass she had asked Ida to cut for her. Eleanor May, at her sewing table in the lamplight, 2 small girls at her feet, her face turned slightly towards some middle distance that held something private in it, something that was hers alone. Then Wren placed her hand flat against the stone beside her sister's hand and over the place where Caleb's had been, and she stayed there for a while. Ida stood behind all 3 of them and placed her hands on their shoulders, one on Caleb's left shoulder and one spanning both girls, a gesture that was not quite a blessing and not quite a claim, but contained elements of both. "Eleanor May," she said quietly, "you raised warriors, and we'll make sure the world knows it." They stayed on the hill for a time that could not have been measured in any useful unit, long enough for the cold to become familiar, long enough for whatever needed to happen in that place to happen. Then they stood and walked back to the wagon, and they drove north out of Millhaven toward the ranch that waited for them above the green hills. On the last rise before the road turned down toward home, Wren said, "Papa, stop here a minute." Caleb stopped the wagon. Wren climbed down and walked to the edge of the rise, and she stood there, looking at the valley below. The main house with its limestone walls and its timber frame built to outlast the ambitions of whoever built it. The barns and the corrals and the pastures running out to the horizon with the winter cattle scattered through them, like punctuation in a long sentence that was still being written. All of it in the cold morning light, solid and real, and exactly what it appeared to be. Clara came to stand beside her, then Ida, Then Caleb, who put his hands in his coat pockets and looked at the thing he had built from solitude and guilt and the long, slow work of years, and saw it differently now. Saw it as something that had been waiting all along for the purpose it had finally found. Is all that ours? Wren asked. It's ours, Caleb said. Forever, forever. Wren stood with this for a moment. Then she opened her notebook and she began to draw. Not the valley below, not the house or the barns or the winter cattle. She drew the four of them standing on the rise, looking at their life together from above. The way it looked from the outside, the way it would look to someone passing by who didn't know the story. Four people. A tall Tamian, a girl with dark braided hair, a small girl, a woman with straight posture. Standing together on a hill in winter, looking at what they had built from broken things and hard choices, and the particular refusal to stop trying that had brought them against all reasonable expectation to this. When she finished the drawing, she wrote across the top in letters that were getting steadier every week. Our family, February 1885, forever. And beneath that, smaller, in the space at the bottom of the page, the words that were hers and that belonged to the private account she kept of the things she knew to be true. We chose each other. That is enough. Caleb looked at those words over her shoulder. He read them once. He did not say anything because there was nothing to say that the words hadn't already covered, and he had learned in the months since two girls had come into his life on a July morning and rearranged everything that sometimes the right response to a thing is simply to let it stand. They climbed back into the wagon. Caleb took up the reins. Flint and the bay shifted in their traces and found the road. They went home. The four of them went home together through the cold blue morning, down the familiar road, past the limestone outcroppings, in the cedar, in the bare live oaks that knew how to wait for spring, and the ranch came up to meet them. The way home comes up to meet a person who has finally stopped running from it, steadily, without hurry, without drama. Simply there the way it had always been there, waiting for someone to decide it was worth staying for. It was worth staying for. It had always been worth staying for. That was in the end what Caleb Harding had come home to learn. Not the facts of his own history, not the resolution of his guilt, not the answer to the question of blood and belonging that had driven him back to Millhaven on a July morning with a dead woman's letter in his pocket. What he had come home to learn was simpler and harder than any of that. A man keeps his word, not when it is easy, not when the outcome is certain, not when the people he has made his promises to are in a position to reward him for keeping them. He keeps his word because that is what a kept word means, because the value of it lives precisely in the unconditional nature of it, because the version of it that comes with conditions is not a promise, but a transaction. And Caleb Harding had made enough transactions in his life and was done with them. He kept his word. And in the keeping of it, he found what he had spent 7 years in solitude and 35 years of living, failing to find by any other method. He found that the house behind him had become a home. He found that the two small girls sitting beside him on the wagon bench, one leaning against his arm, and one watching the road ahead with those pale, cataloging eyes, were his daughters in the only sense of the word that had ever mattered. He found that Ida, sitting straight-backed in the seat behind them with her hands in her lap and her eyes on the country they were passing through, was his family, not by the accident of shared blood, but by the harder and more deliberate process of choosing to be, which was a process she had initiated and he had been slow to recognize, and which he intended going forward not to take for granted. And he found in the space between one breath and the next on a winter road in Texas, with the cold pressing in and the ranch coming into view below, that the weight he had carried for 10 years, the stone in his chest that he had built his life around, had somewhere in the past months become something different. Not gone. He did not believe it would ever be entirely gone, but changed in its nature, transformed from something that pressed down to something that had been pressed into a shape, and the shape it had been pressed into was this. These people, this road, this morning. This was what Eleanor May Sutton's death had required of him. Not grief alone, not an apology, not the performance of remorse delivered to a stone on a hill. This, the living version of the debt, the daily, ordinary, unremarkable act of staying. Flint found the pace he liked on the downhill stretch, and the wagon rolled forward, and behind them, the white marble headstone on the hill above Millhaven caught the winter light and held it for a moment before the road turned and the view closed behind the cedars, and Eleanor May Sutton was out of sight, but not out of anything else. She was in the way Clara held herself when she walked into a room. She was in the way Wren drew what she saw with the precision of someone who understands that seeing clearly is its own form of testimony. She was in the needle and thread that were waiting on the kitchen table at the ranch where Clara was learning to sew, where something Eleanor May had spent her life doing was being passed forward into hands that were ready to receive it. She had made something beautiful out of whatever she was handed, and now her daughters were doing the same. And the man who had failed her once, who had come back too late and found something else entirely, was doing the same. They went home.